There's something about the forest that feels timeless, like it holds secrets older than we can imagine. Hidden trails, abandoned landmarks, and whispers carried by the wind. Each step deeper into the woods feels like peeling back layers of a story no one was meant to hear. I've always been drawn to places like this, chasing the beauty of untouched nature and the thrill of discovering what others leave behind. But not all stories are meant to be uncovered. The ranger warned me about the strange lights at night, but I didn't listen. They led me to an old, forgotten campsite, and something else that still lingers there. The fog that rolled in on my hike should have been my cue to turn back, but I followed a flicker in the mist and found myself lost in a nightmare that wasn't mine to escape. Then there's the glowing field beneath the tower, a place where the air hums with energy and the lights seem alive, watching, waiting for anyone foolish enough to linger. And at the edge of the forest, the silent lake reflects more than just the trees around it. Its surface mirrors things that aren't there until they are. These aren't just stories of eerie places, they're warnings, and once you hear them, you'll never walk the woods alone without wondering if the forest is watching you back. It started with a simple warning. The forest ranger told me not to wander too far from the camp at night. "The lights," he said, "don't follow them." His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a flicker of fear maybe. I laughed it off, thinking he was just trying to mess with the city guy out in the woods. Turns out, he wasn't trying to scare me. He was trying to save my life. I'd planned this trip for months. Work had been suffocating and I needed to clear my head. A friend recommended this remote forest, miles from any major city, where the stargazing was supposed to be incredible. I was camping solo, something I'd done plenty of times before, but this was different. No cell service, no other campers, just me and the trees. The first day was uneventful. I set up my tent, collected firewood, and spent the afternoon hiking one of the nearby trails. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, like the trees were listening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sky turned a deep orange, and I decided to light a fire and settle in for the evening. That's when the ranger showed up. He came out of nowhere, his silhouette appearing just beyond the glow of my campfire. I hadn't heard him approach, and for a moment it startled me. He was tall, with a weathered face and a green uniform that looked a little too clean for someone working in the middle of nowhere. "Evening," he said, nodding politely. "Evening," I replied, still trying to shake off the unease his sudden appearance caused. "You camping out here alone?" he asked. I nodded. "Just for the weekend. Needed to get away for a bit." He glanced around my campsite, his expression unreadable. "Listen," he said after a moment, his tone lowering. "Stay close to your camp tonight. Don't wander. And if you see any lights, don't follow them." "Lights?" I asked, confused. He nodded again. "They'll look harmless. Pretty even. But trust me, they're not. Just stay put and you'll be fine." Before I could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and disappeared into the woods, leaving me alone with my thoughts and a growing sense of unease. As the night wore on, I tried to brush off the encounter. I figured the ranger was just superstitious, or maybe trying to keep me from wandering into a dangerous part of the forest. Either way, I wasn't about to let a ghost story ruin my trip. The stars were incredible, just as my friend had promised. I lay on my back, staring up at the glittering expanse above me, feeling more at peace than I had in months. That peace didn't last long. It started as a faint flicker at the edge of my vision. At first, I thought it was a firefly, but as I sat up and focused, I realized it was something else, an orb of light, about the size of a baseball, hovering just beyond the tree line. I watched, mesmerized, as it floated lazily between the trees, its soft glow pulsating like a heartbeat. Another orb appeared, then another, until there were 5 or 6 of them, moving in a slow, deliberate pattern. For a moment, I forgot the ranger's warning. The lights were beautiful, otherworldly even. I found myself standing, drawn to them without even realizing it. But as I stepped closer, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the night sounds, crickets, distant owls, went silent. The lights moved further into the woods, and before I knew it, I was following them. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the forest was trying to hold me back. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, but the lights remained vivid, beckoning me deeper into the trees. It wasn't until I lost sight of my campfire that I realized how far I'd gone. The unease from earlier returned, stronger now. I stopped walking, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. The lights hovered ahead, almost mocking me with their stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow. No response. I turned to go back, but the lights moved again, this time circling me like predators sizing up their prey. The unease twisted into fear as I realized I had no idea where I was. Then I saw it, an old campsite hidden among the trees. The tents were tattered, their fabric hanging in shreds, and rusted cooking pots lay scattered across the ground. Everything was overgrown, as if it had been abandoned for years. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding. The lights hovered around the campsite, their glow casting long, eerie shadows. That's when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I thought I'd imagined it. Then came the footsteps, soft, deliberate, circling the campsite. My flashlight whipped around, searching for the source, but there was nothing there, just the lights and the ruins of the camp. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. Then the lights vanished, plunging me into complete darkness. Panic set in. I fumbled for my flashlight, which flickered weakly before steadying. The forest felt alive around me, every rustle and creak sending my heart racing. I turned and ran, branches clawing at my arms and face as I stumbled through the trees. My breaths came in ragged gasps, and my legs burned, but I didn't dare stop. When I finally saw the glow of my campfire, relief washed over me like a wave. I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for air. It wasn't until I caught my breath that I noticed something was off. My campsite was exactly as I'd left it, except for one thing. My phone, which had been sitting on the picnic table, was now lying on the ground. Picking it up, I unlocked the screen and froze. The photo gallery was open, filled with dozens of new pictures I hadn't taken. Each one showed the lights, hovering closer and closer until the final image was of my tent, taken from just a few feet away. My blood ran cold as I realized what the ranger had been trying to warn me about. The lights weren't just pretty, they were hunting. The fog rolled in faster than I expected, turning the hiking trail into a maze. It was supposed to be a straightforward day hike, 6 miles out and back through one of the most scenic routes in the national park. I'd checked the weather before setting out, but nothing in the forecast mentioned fog. By the time I realized how thick it was getting, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains. My usual landmarks, trees with unusual shapes, a boulder I'd passed earlier, were swallowed by the grey. Every direction looked the same. I quickened my pace, hoping to reach my car before darkness fell. But as the trail seemed to disappear beneath the swirling mist, my confidence wavered. The silence didn't help. Normally you'd hear birds or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but now there was nothing, just my own footsteps crunching against the dirt path. I was scanning the fog for anything familiar when I saw it, the faint glow of a light just ahead. Relief washed over me. It had to be another hiker or maybe a park ranger. Either way, someone who could help me find my way back. "Hey!" I called out, waving my arms. The light didn't respond. It hovered there, steady and warm, just visible through the dense fog. I moved toward it, my boots crunching against the trail. "Hello?" I called again, louder this time. The light shifted slightly, moving deeper into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, glancing back the way I came. The trail behind me was indistinguishable from the fog. I had no choice but to follow. The light bobbed ahead, leading me off the path and into the trees. It wasn't until I noticed the silence breaking, small cracks of twigs, distant whispers, that I began to feel uneasy. "Is someone there?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. A soft laugh echoed through the mist. It wasn't friendly. I should have turned back, but I was too far in now. My phone had no signal, and I couldn't see the trail anymore. The light was my only guide. As I followed it further, the forest around me seemed to change. The trees were gnarled and twisted, their branches forming unnatural shapes against the fog. Shadows moved at the edge of my vision, but when I turned my flashlight toward them, there was nothing there. The light stayed just out of reach, flickering faintly as if it were teasing me. I quickened my pace, nearly jogging now, my breaths coming in short, sharp gasps. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were an unintelligible cacophony. And then, suddenly, the light disappeared. I stopped, the darkness pressing in around me. My flashlight beam seemed weaker now, barely illuminating a few feet in front of me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. A branch snapped behind me and I whipped around, shining my flashlight into the trees. There was nothing there, just the fog, thick and unyielding. Another laugh, closer this time. Panic set in. I turned back the way I thought I'd come, trying to retrace my steps, but the forest was unrecognizable. Every tree looked the same, and the whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. After what felt like hours, I stumbled into a clearing. My heart sank as I saw it, a small decaying wooden cabin sitting in the middle of the clearing. Its roof sagged, and the windows were boarded up. The air around it was heavy, and the fog seemed to thicken, clinging to the rotting wood like a second skin. The light flickered back to life, hovering just outside the cabin door. It stayed there for a moment, then vanished. I didn't want to go inside, but the whispers were closing in, circling me like predators. With no other choice, I pushed open the door and stepped into the cabin. The interior was worse than the outside. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and the smell of damp rot filled the air. My flashlight revealed walls covered in carvings, dozens of crude drawings etched into the wood. Most of the carvings were of lights, small glowing orbs surrounded by stick figures with empty faces. Others were warnings: "Stay on the trail. Don't follow them. They're not what they seem." I moved deeper into the cabin, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. A table sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in more carvings. My flashlight beam caught something shiny, a knife, old and rusted, lying next to a journal. I picked up the journal, flipping through its yellowed pages. The handwriting was frantic, barely legible in places. It told the story of someone else who had followed the lights, someone who had been lured into the woods and trapped. The final entry made my blood run cold. "They never let you leave." The whispers erupted into laughter, loud and piercing. The cabin shook, the walls creaking as if something outside was pressing against them. I ran. Bursting through the door, I sprinted back into the fog, not caring which direction I went. The laughter followed me, echoing through the trees, and the light appeared again, flickering in and out of sight. This time, I didn't follow it. I ran until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would explode. Somehow, by some miracle, I stumbled back onto the trail. The fog began to lift as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight piercing through the trees. When I finally reached my car, I collapsed against it, gasping for air. Later, I told a park ranger about the cabin. He gave me a strange look. "There's no cabin in those woods," he said. I didn't argue, but when I got home and unpacked my bag, I found something that shouldn't have been there, a page torn from the journal, the final words scrawled across it in bold, shaky letters. "They never let you leave." My job was simple: maintain the communication towers on the edge of the forest, climb up, check the wiring, replace anything broken, and log my findings. I'd been doing it for years, and it had always been routine, but nothing prepared me for what I found in the field beneath the tower that day. The assignment came in late, just before I was set to head home. The communication tower deep in the Renshaw forest had gone offline, and I was the closest technician. It wasn't a popular area. No hiking trails, no scenic views, just endless trees and this lone, towering structure in the middle of a clearing. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The tower loomed above me, a skeletal silhouette against the dimming sky. My truck's headlights illuminated the clearing around it, a wide expanse of overgrown grass and scattered wildflowers. Locals called this place the Glowing Grave. I'd heard the stories, how people claimed to see strange lights in the field at night, how animals avoided it entirely. But I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. At first, everything seemed normal. The equipment looked intact, and the area was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I climbed the tower, checked the wiring, and ran a diagnostic. Nothing was out of place, but then I noticed something strange. From the top of the tower, I had a clear view of the field below. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the grass seemed to take on a faint glow. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as the sky darkened, the glow grew brighter. I climbed down and stepped into the field, curiosity outweighing caution. The glow wasn't uniform. It was concentrated in patches, forming faint patterns across the ground. At first they looked random, but the more I stared, the more I realized they weren't. They were shapes, intricate symbols that reminded me of constellations. The air around me felt heavy, like the moments before a thunderstorm. I could hear a faint hum, so low it was more of a vibration than a sound. The forest, which had been alive with the chirps of crickets and the rustling of leaves, had gone completely silent. I should have left right then and there. Instead, I crouched down to examine the patterns more closely. The glow didn't come from the grass itself. It hovered just above the ground, like mist catching the light. When I reached out to touch it, my hand passed through the glow and a shiver ran up my spine. That's when I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I stood up, spinning around to find the source, but the field was empty. The voice came again, clearer this time. It wasn't loud, but it carried through the still air with an unnatural clarity. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was a low chuckle, barely more than a breath, coming from the edge of the field. I turned my flashlight toward the trees, and that's when I saw them. Figures, shadowy and indistinct, standing just at the tree line. There were 3 of them, maybe more, their forms blending into the darkness. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching. My flashlight flickered, and the hum in the air grew louder. The glow on the ground began to shift, the patterns rearranging themselves into something new, something I couldn't understand but felt in my gut was wrong. I stepped back, my heart pounding. The figures didn't follow, but their presence pressed against me, suffocating. I turned and ran. The tower was my only anchor, a beacon in the growing darkness. I sprinted toward it, my boots slipping on the uneven ground. When I reached the base, I grabbed my tools and climbed halfway up, desperate to put distance between me and whatever was in the field. From my perch, I could see the entire clearing. The glow had spread, forming a web of intricate patterns that pulsed with light. The figures at the edge of the field were still there, but now they were joined by more, dozens of them, all standing in eerie silence. I fumbled with my radio, hoping to call for help, but it was dead. My phone too. The hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through the metal frame of the tower. Then the lights on the ground began to move. They formed a line stretching from the base of the tower into the darkest part of the forest. It was a path, one that seemed to beckon me forward. The voices started again, calling my name in a distorted harmony. My skin crawled as I realized they weren't just coming from the field, they were coming from inside my head. I scrambled down the tower, desperate to leave, but when I reached the ground, my tools were gone. My bag, my equipment, everything had vanished, as if it had never been there. Panic set in as I sprinted back to my truck, half expecting to find it missing too. Thankfully, it was still there, but when I reached for the door handle, my reflection in the window stopped me cold. It wasn't mine. The face staring back at me was pale and hollow-eyed, its mouth twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. I staggered back, and when I looked again, it was gone. The hum in the air reached a deafening pitch as I jumped into the truck and slammed the door. The headlights flicked on automatically, illuminating the field in front of me. The figures were gone, but the glow remained, now brighter than ever. The patterns on the ground shifted one last time, forming a single word that burned into my mind. Stay. I didn't. The truck roared to life, and I sped out of the clearing, the path barely visible in the dim light. The glow faded in my rearview mirror, but the hum stayed with me, lingering in my chest like an ache. It wasn't until I was miles away that the noise finally stopped. When I got home that night, I thought I was safe. But as I sat in my living room, the radio on the shelf crackled to life. At first, it was static. Then came the voice. My voice, distorted and wrong, repeating a single word over and over. Stay. I turned the radio off, but the hum never left me. It was the last person I expected to see in the middle of the forest. The ranger who warned me about the lights had disappeared a decade ago. Photography had always been a passion of mine, and forgotten landmarks were my favorite subjects. There was something haunting about capturing the remnants of places people had left behind, their stories frozen in time. That's what brought me to the Ridgeview National Forest. Deep within the woods, there was an abandoned ranger station. It had been closed for years, ever since a ranger vanished while investigating strange lights reported in the area. No one ever found him, and locals said the station was cursed. That didn't stop me. It only made it more interesting. The hike to the station was long and quiet. The forest felt alive in a way that was almost oppressive, the trees towering overhead and blocking out most of the sunlight. By the time I reached the clearing where the station stood, the late afternoon light was already fading. The building was smaller than I'd expected, a single-story structure with boarded-up windows and a sagging roof. Vines crept up the walls, and the paint was peeling in long strips. My boots crunched over broken glass and dead leaves as I approached. I paused for a moment, taking in the eerie stillness. There was no wind, no sound of animals, just an unnatural silence that pressed against my ears. Shaking off the unease, I raised my camera and started shooting. The station was perfect. The way the fading light hit the warped wood and broken windows created the kind of mood that would make for incredible photos. I circled the building, looking for interesting angles when something caught my eye. Footprints. They were faint but unmistakable, leading away from the station and into the woods. They looked fresh, too, the edges of the prints still sharp in the loose dirt. I frowned, glancing back at the station. It didn't seem like anyone had been here in years, but the footprints told a different story. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow them. The trail led me deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser with each step. The light was fading fast, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the ground. My camera swung around my neck as I walked, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I'd like to admit. That's when I saw the lights. At first, it was just one, a faint, flickering glow hovering in the distance. Then another appeared and another, until there were half a dozen of them, bobbing gently between the trees. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The lights were beautiful in a way that felt unnatural, their glow too steady, too perfect. I thought about turning back, but the footprints continued toward the lights, and my curiosity pushed me forward. The air grew colder as I approached, my breath fogging in front of me. The lights pulsed softly, forming a loose circle around a small clearing, and in the center of that clearing stood a man. My heart stopped. It was the ranger. I recognized him instantly from the photos I'd seen online. Tall, broad-shouldered, with short-cropped hair and a green uniform. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his eyes had a distant, glassy look, like he was staring through me rather than at me. "You need to leave," he said, his voice flat and mechanical. I took a step closer, my throat dry. Are you the ranger? The one who disappeared?" He didn't answer. Instead, he repeated himself, louder this time. "You need to leave. Don't look back." "What's going on here?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Where did you go? What are these lights?" "It's too late," he said, his tone unchanging. "They've already seen you." The lights began to pulse faster, their glow intensifying. The hum of energy filled the air, vibrating through my chest. "What do you mean?" I asked, panic creeping into my voice. He took a step toward me, his movements stiff and jerky. "Don't look back. Whatever you do, don't look back." And then he was gone. One moment he was there, and the next, the lights flared blindingly bright, and when they dimmed, the clearing was empty. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I spun around, searching for him. The lights began to drift closer, their movements deliberate, like they were studying me. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, and I could feel the ground vibrating beneath my feet. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I barreled through the woods, my camera thumping against my chest. The lights followed, their glow casting long, twisting shadows that seemed to reach for me. The hum was inside my head now, pounding like a second heartbeat. I don't know how long I ran, but when I finally reached the ranger station, I felt a moment of relief. I grabbed the door handle and yanked, but it wouldn't budge. The station was locked. I stepped back, my chest heaving. The building didn't look the same anymore. The boards over the windows were intact, the roof no longer sagging. It looked untouched, as if I'd never been inside. The lights appeared again, surrounding the clearing in a perfect circle. Their glow reflected off the station's broken glass, casting eerie patterns across the walls. The whispers started then, faint at first but growing louder. They weren't coming from the lights, they were coming from inside the station. My hand trembled as I reached for my camera. Lifting it to my eye, I snapped a few pictures, the shutter clicking loudly in the silence. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a single distorted voice. "Leave." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran back to the trailhead, the lights flickering in and out of sight behind me. The hum faded as I reached the edge of the woods, and when I finally saw my car, I nearly collapsed in relief. I drove back to town, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached. Later, I told a park ranger about the encounter. He looked at me like I was crazy. "There haven't been rangers at that station for years," he said. "I know," I replied, "but I saw him. I talked to him." The ranger shook his head. "That's not possible. He disappeared 10 years ago, and no one's been able to explain it." I didn't argue. When I got home, I plugged in my camera to review the photos I'd taken. Most of them were normal, shots of the station, the clearing, the lights. But in the last few pictures, I noticed something strange. The lights weren't just random shapes. They were forming a figure, a man, and in the final photo, he was standing right behind me. There's a lake deep in the forest that most people don't know about. It's not marked on any maps, and you won't find any signs pointing you toward it. The locals call it Stillwater Lake, but they rarely speak of it, except to warn people like me to stay away. I should have listened. I found out about the lake while browsing an online forum for hiking enthusiasts. A user had posted vague directions, describing it as a hidden gem, untouched by tourists and surrounded by breathtaking views. I was an avid hiker, always chasing the next perfect photo, so of course I had to see it for myself. The hike was grueling, 5 miles off the main trail, through dense forest and rough terrain. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was already sinking low on the horizon, but the moment I saw it, I forgot my exhaustion. The lake was unnaturally beautiful. The water was perfectly still, like a sheet of glass reflecting the sky and trees around it with eerie clarity. The air was cool and quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the last person on Earth. I set up my camera, eager to capture the scene before the light faded. As I snapped photos, I noticed something odd. In the reflection on the water, the trees on the far side of the lake seemed wrong, warped and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. But when I looked directly at them, they appeared normal. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to the angle of the light or a trick of my camera lens. The first real warning came when I skipped a stone across the water. It was something I'd done 1,000 times before, but this time the stone didn't ripple the surface. It skimmed across the water like it was solid, leaving no trace behind. I froze, staring at the lake. The air felt heavier now, the silence deeper. Even the sound of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the distant chirp of birds, was gone. That's when I noticed the figure on the far shore. It was faint at first, barely visible in the fading light. A person standing perfectly still at the water's edge. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing across the lake. The figure didn't move. I squinted, trying to make out any details, but the shadows were too thick. Still, something about their posture seemed wrong. Their head was tilted slightly, as if they were watching me. A shiver ran down my spine, and I turned my attention back to my camera, telling myself it was just another hiker. But when I glanced back, the figure was closer. They hadn't moved. Not in the way people move, but now they were standing halfway around the lake, their reflection perfectly mirrored in the still water. I packed up my gear, my hands trembling. The unease that had been building in my chest now twisted into full-blown fear. As I turned to leave, I saw something that stopped me cold. Another reflection in the water. This one wasn't on the far side of the lake. It was behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The reflection, however, remained. It stood tall and distorted, its head cocked at an unnatural angle, watching me from the lake's surface. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I bolted into the woods, my heart pounding as the underbrush clawed at my legs. The path I'd followed to get there was gone, swallowed by the trees, and I found myself running blindly, the lake's eerie stillness lingering in my mind. The further I ran, the quieter the forest became, until the only sound was my own ragged breathing. I stopped to catch my breath, leaning against a tree, and that's when I saw it again. The reflection. It was on the ground now, shimmering faintly in a puddle of rainwater. The figure in it was closer, clearer, its hollow eyes locked onto mine. I ran again, ignoring the burning in my legs, ignoring the shadows that seemed to stretch and twist around me. I didn't stop until I saw the trailhead, the parking lot just beyond it. When I reached my car, I jumped in and locked the doors, my chest heaving. For a moment, I felt safe. But as I started the engine, I glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. The reflection was there, sitting in the back seat. Its head tilted slowly, its hollow eyes meeting mine. I don't remember much after that. I must have driven home on autopilot, because the next thing I knew, I was sitting in my driveway, the car still running. The reflection was gone, but the memory of it lingered, burned into my mind. Later, when I reviewed the photos from my trip, I found something chilling. In every shot of the lake, the reflection of the figure was there, standing closer and closer in each frame, until the last photo. where it stood directly behind me. I've never gone back to the forest, but sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something in the mirror, a reflection that doesn't belong to me.